death row inmate in the U.S., and his scheme to escape execution. The story begins in the scorching summer of the Lone Star State, where Michael Turner, a man known just as much for his charm as for his chilling crimes, is facing the ultimate punishment: death. At 32, his name had already etched itself into the annals of true crime. Convicted in 2017 for the brutal kidnapping, murder, and disposal of Emily Parker's body, a 22-year-old college student brimming with life and ambition, Michael had spent the past 5 years on death row at Highland Creek Correctional Facility in Texas. The execution date was finalized, no appeals left, justice was ready to be served, or so everyone thought. Michael wasn't your ordinary death row inmate. Unlike others who spent their days writing letters of repentance or reconnecting with estranged family members, Michael played the waiting game, sharpening his mind and watching for just the right moment to act. His charisma and strategic mind had worked wonders over the years, even gaining him interviews with journalists curious about what lurked behind his unapologetic smile. But behind that calm demeanor lay a predator who was always a few steps ahead of everyone else around him. In Texas' justice system, swift but fair was the motto, and Michael's crimes spared him no sympathy. Emily Parker's case had gripped the nation, a promising journalism major who vanished without a trace after a summer internship. It took investigators a grueling 6 months of searching, anonymous tips, and relentless police work to find her remains hidden in an abandoned quarry. Evidence against Michael had been overwhelming: a strand of Emily's hair in his trunk, surveillance footage placing his vehicle near the location on the night she disappeared, and bloodstains that told a grim tale. The jury took only 3 hours to convict him, yet Michael, ever the puppet master, had something else in mind. While courtrooms and lawyers played chess with legalities, he waited silently, storing every piece of information he overheard in prison like treasures in a vault. From childhood, Michael had been known as a man who could see the world not for what it was, but for how it could be manipulated. To him, death row was not an endgame, but just another chessboard on which he could move the pieces. Now came July 14, 2022, a day etched in the calendars of the Parker family as their final step towards closure. The penitentiary walls buzzed with an unfamiliar tension as the countdown began. Guards patrolled the corridors, protesters gathered outside, and prison chaplains readied the Bible for Michael's final rites. Visitors weren't allowed. The only audience Michael would have was a weary group of correctional officers, a warden tired of handling national headlines and a country awaiting justice. Hours before the needle would pierce his skin, Michael made his move. He called for the prison warden, demanding to meet with Judge Harold Fletcher, the man who had presided over his trial years ago. His excuse? He had information that could solve another cold case and claimed he had wanted to speak months earlier, but feared for his life. The inmates in Highland Creek weren't kind to suspected snitches, and Michael played his fear card well. "I owe Emily's family the truth," he said, "but before I die, I owe the truth to someone else's family too." Judge Fletcher, skeptical but duty-bound, couldn't afford to ignore the gravity of the claim. After consulting with Texas Rangers, an emergency meeting was arranged. The execution was momentarily delayed, and Michael, faced with armed guards and the suspicious glares of detectives, sat across a conference room table from the people who held his life, or death, in their hands. Every eye watched for deceit, but Michael played his part convincingly. He spoke of a journalist in Denver, Colorado, David Brooks, whose murder had left authorities bamboozled 7 years earlier. Michael claimed to know exactly who was behind it. "I was there," he said solemnly, "not as a participant but as a witness. I know where the murder weapon is, and I can give you names." It was a dramatic turn no one had anticipated. But what was Michael's endgame here? The ink had long since dried on sentencing papers, and no information could legally cleanse his slate. Yet Michael wasn't bargaining to walk free, he simply wanted to buy time. And time, more than freedom, was a currency he understood how to spend. The mysterious plan, moments before execution. The countdown to Michael Turner's execution was ticking mercilessly. The hands of the clock seemed louder than ever as they marked each passing second inside the concrete fortress of Highland Creek Correctional Facility. The air felt heavy, charged with anticipation, both inside and out. Groups of protesters camped outside, some chanting for justice, others condemning the death penalty. Reporters scanned the prison grounds, waiting for any sliver of breaking news. Meanwhile, inside the death row block, calm but calculated chaos was unraveling. Michael Turner, dressed in the familiar khaki prison uniform, sat quietly in his cell. The calmness on his face, however, was a mask hiding a storm of preparation. Over the last 3 years he had meticulously crafted a plan, layered, detailed, ingenious enough to buy himself the only thing he needed: more time. Time to think, to maneuver, and to manipulate the system he had studied tirelessly from the inside. To him the law wasn't a rigid set of rules, it was a game, one he had trained himself to play with disturbing precision. At 10:45 a.m. on the morning of his scheduled execution, the guards arrived outside his cell. "Turner, up!" one of them barked, rattling the bars. Michael stood up slowly, his cuffs clinking softly as they were secured around his wrists. He nodded to the guards, his expression unreadable, and allowed himself to be led down the stark hallways toward the death chamber. It was only an hour before his life would end, officially at least. "I need to speak to the warden," Michael said suddenly, his voice calm but purposeful. The guards exchanged skeptical glances. Death row inmates, especially on their final walk, rarely wasted time on requests. But Michael wasn't like any other inmate. There was always precision in his movements, in his timing. "What for?" one of the guards asked, irritation clear in his tone. "It's important. Very important," Michael replied, locking eyes with the man. His voice, while steady, carried a subtle undertone of urgency. "If I go to that table without being heard, there will be consequences bigger than you can imagine." It was the kind of statement that demanded attention, but gave away nothing. Reluctantly, after a brief huddle with supervisors, the warden was called. Within minutes the small, wiry man who had overseen Michael's imprisonment approached him, flanked by several armed guards. "What is it, Turner?" the warden asked impatiently, glancing at his watch. "You've had years to say whatever you're going to say, why now?" Michael raised his chin slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Because it's the kind of truth you don't take to the grave," he said, his lips curling into the faintest trace of a smile. "There's a cold case you've probably heard of. The Brooks murder in Denver. I know who did it. I know where the weapon is. And I know there's evidence you'll never find without me." The warden's expression tightened, his patience visibly thinning. "You're stalling." "Maybe," Michael admitted nonchalantly. He shrugged lightly, the chains on his wrists jangling against his movements. "But you have to ask yourself, what if I'm not?" The insinuation hung in the air like a weight. The Brooks murder, highly publicized, unsolved, with national sympathy pouring out for the family of the late journalist David Brooks, was exactly the type of case the media loved. It took one nod from the warden, and suddenly Michael's execution was delayed by an indefinite but irritatingly necessary investigation. Within 30 minutes, Michael was seated in a cold, featureless conference room under maximum security surveillance. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Judge Harold Fletcher, summoned in emergency capacity, entered the room with several detectives and 2 Texas Rangers. Their body language spoke volumes. They didn't trust Michael, but they also couldn't ignore him. "All right, Turner," the judge began, folding his arms as he sat across from him. "You better have something real, or I'll ensure you make it to that gurney before the sun hits the horizon." Michael smiled faintly, almost in amusement. "Oh, it's real," he said smoothly. "But we'll get to that. First, I need to tell you why you've never solved that case." The room bristled with tension as Michael began weaving his story. He painted a vivid picture of a late summer night in Denver, where he claimed he had been an innocent bystander in a murder orchestrated by 2 men. He described the suspects in chilling detail. One tall with a tattooed forearm, the other stocky with a limp, each detail threading deeper into the investigators' buried frustrations with the case. "But here's what makes this valuable," Michael continued, his voice calm, methodical. "I know where you'll find the knife that killed David Brooks. The prints, the DNA, it's all there. And unless you want another anniversary special on unsolved murders, I'm your map." The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "If you really know all of this, why now? Why not say this 5 years ago, during your trial or appeal?" Michael's demeanor cooled further. "Because back then, I had hope. Lawyers, cases, appeals, you know the drill. Hope's dangerous. It clouds the need for leverage. But now," he glanced calmly at the clock hanging on the wall, "I have nothing to lose. So let me do something useful for once." It became clear to the room that Michael wasn't angling for freedom. He wasn't foolish enough to imagine a get-out-of-jail-free card awaited him. No, this was something else entirely. An elaborate delay, a temporary reprieve from the needle, deadlines pushed just far enough for something else to fall into place. What that something was remained a mystery known only to Michael, but everyone in the room could sense it. He was always playing at least 3 moves ahead. By the time the judge conferred with the legal team and Rangers, enough doubt had been seeded. It wasn't about trusting Michael, it was about the slight but unmistakable possibility that this man knew something valuable. Executing him without exploring the claim would make headlines no one in that room wanted to explain away, and just like that, the clock on Michael Turner's life ticked to a halt, for now. A cold case wrapped in mystery. The Brooks case was a haunting reminder of how some crimes fade into eerie silence, leaving families broken and justice unattained. It had been 7 long years since David Brooks, a tenacious journalist for the Denver Sentinel, was found lifeless in an abandoned parking lot on the outskirts of the city. His death wasn't just a loss, it was a wound for the community, one that the Denver Police Department had failed to close. David Brooks wasn't just a journalist, he was a storyteller, a truth seeker who dedicated his career to unveiling corruption and systemic wrongdoings. His sharp pen had made enemies in high places, but his refusal to back down had won him widespread respect from his peers. At 34 he was in his prime, working on what colleagues described as a career-defining exposé, a story that he had kept closely guarded. On August 12, 2015, David was last seen leaving a diner at 10:15 p.m., a familiar haunt where he would go to gather his thoughts or scribble in his worn leather notebook. Security footage captured him walking to his car, his briefcase clutched tightly, his silhouette disappearing into the humid Denver night. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. The following morning, a jogger discovered his body near an industrial area about 5 miles from the diner. The scene was brutal. He had been stabbed multiple times, but the killing blow, a precise strike to the neck, spoke of cold calculation, not the impulsive rage of a random attacker. His belongings were scattered, but his leather notebook and mobile phone were conspicuously missing. Despite the evidence left behind, the case quickly grew cold. Police initially pursued leads suggesting robbery, but inconsistencies in the crime scene suggested a deeper, darker motive. His wallet had been emptied, but his car keys and watch remained untouched, signs that the killer wanted to obscure their intention. Analysts had their theories, a vendetta tied to one of his exposés, a silencing from powerful enemies, or a crime of passion disguised as something more. For years, speculation ran wild. Conspiracy theories flooded community forums, podcasts dissected the crime scene to nauseating detail, and journalists mourned one of their own. Despite the media frenzy, no promising suspects were ever brought to justice. Investigators likened the case to chasing a ghost, whispers of evidence that always seemed to evaporate the moment they felt close. David's family bore the brunt of the unresolved tragedy. His sister, Emma Brooks, turned into a fierce advocate for her brother's legacy. Over the years, she campaigned tirelessly to keep his story alive, organizing rallies, working with cold case units, and even appearing on national news segments pleading for anyone with information to come forward. David's voice was stolen, she would say through gritted teeth, but we won't let his story be buried. But nothing came of it. Years passed, investigators retired, evidence gathered a layer of dust, and David Brooks's name became just another unsolved headline from a bygone era. So when Michael Turner, a convicted murderer sitting on death row in Texas, dropped David's name during a last-minute plea for his life, it sent shockwaves through the small group of journalists and law enforcement officers who remembered the case. Michael's claim was simple, yet chillingly specific. He not only knew who killed David Brooks, but he also knew where to find the murder weapon, a knife with DNA evidence that authorities had long suspected was key to solving the case. According to Michael, he had been in Denver the night of Brooks's murder, not as the killer but as an unfortunate witness, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Skeptics abounded. After all, Michael's reputation as a conniving, manipulative felon preceded him. Everything about his demeanor screamed that this was part of an elaborate charade. Yet, his knowledge of details that had never been made public, the exact brand of knife suspected in the murder, the unreported detail of Brooks's missing notebook, and most disturbingly, a vivid description of the industrial lot where the murder had occurred, was impossible to dismiss outright. They were professionals, Michael told the investigators who grilled him during his emergency meeting with Judge Harold Fletcher. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing, they knew what they were doing. They were looking for something, and when they didn't find it, well, you know how that kind of thing goes. Michael's cryptic language did little to endear him to a room full of seasoned detectives, but one point stuck out. They didn't find it. Some metaphorical it, lurking on the edge of every conspiracy surrounding David Brooks' final days. Had he hidden the exposé he was working on? Was his murder a cover-up for something he had uncovered but hadn't yet published? One detective, Sergeant Mark Yates, became particularly fixated on Michael's claim. Yates had worked the Brooks case for years before being reassigned, and while Michael's sudden revelation wreaked havoc with his suspicions, it also rekindled his obsession with uncovering the truth. What bothered him most was how Michael had zero connection to Denver, or to Brooks's circle of friends and associates. So how did this man from Texas, already condemned for another heinous crime, know so much? Theories ballooned. Some wondered if Michael's crime spree could have extended to Colorado, positioning him as a potential suspect all along. Others worried that he had manufactured the entire confession with fragments of overheard truths from his years in prison, using it as a death row bargaining chip. Either way, his statements reopened a wound that had scarred over, renewing pressure to investigate David Brooks's murder. The Brooks family was divided. Emma Brooks, ever the tireless advocate for bringing her brother's killer to justice, was cautiously hopeful. Her voice cracked during an interview with a local news outlet just days after Michael's confession. If there's even a small chance that this man knows something, anything, then we owe it to David to follow through. My brother's death deserves the truth. We deserve the truth. But the machinery of the law churned slowly. Authorities were skeptical of reopening a case based solely on the word of a man who had spent years deceiving everyone around him. Still, there was an undeniable itch, the possibility, however slight, that Michael wasn't lying, that he could deliver the key that 7 years of investigation had failed to uncover. And so, the cold case of David Brooks was thrust back into the spotlight, dark clouds once again swirling over Denver. If Michael Turner was lying, it would amount to the cruelest betrayal of a grieving family, but if he was telling the truth, it might just solve one of the most confounding puzzles the city had ever faced. The shocking testimony. The room sat in thick, suffocating silence as Michael Turner leaned back in his chair, his cuffs clinking lightly against the metal table. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes betrayed a sharpness that set everyone on edge. Michael knew how to wield his words and timing like weapons, and the room of detectives, Texas Rangers, and the skeptical Judge Harold Fletcher all braced themselves for what was to come. Whatever he was about to say, they knew it wasn't going to be simple. "All right, Turner," Fletcher said firmly, his tone pressing Michael to cut through the silence. "You've got everyone's attention. Enough theatrics. What do you have to say?" Michael exhaled deeply, feigning a mixture of burden and relief, as if what he was about to say was some noble act of conscience. But everyone in that room knew better. Michael Turner was a puppet master, and this wasn't remorse, it was calculation. "Judge," Michael began, his voice steady and deliberate, "I'm not proud of what I've done in this life, but there's one thing I can do before it's over, one truth I can give back before I leave this world." No one moved. Every eye locked on him. He let the moment hang in the air just long enough for everyone's suspicion to blur into curiosity. "It's about David Brooks," Michael said finally, his voice nearly dropping to a whisper. "The journalist. Everybody said his murder was random, senseless. Everyone was wrong." Detective Mark Yates, the man who had poured years into the unyielding mystery of the Brooks case, straightened in his seat, muscles taut with newfound focus. Michael continued. "I was there that night in Denver, not by choice, mind you. I was running a job, a side hustle, and I got tangled up in something that turned into a nightmare. A nightmare I'm willing to help you end, but only if you listen." The room bristled at the implication of a condition. It was typical Michael Turner, never giving without taking. But as much as Fletcher and the detectives hated being in this room with him, they also couldn't ignore the small but mounting chance that he knew something worth hearing. Yates, who had become notoriously obsessed with the Brooks case, wasn't about to let pride or distaste for Michael get in the way. "Go ahead," Yates pressed, gripping the edge of the chair. "What do you claim to know?" Michael leaned forward, his cuffs digging into his wrists but his focus never wavering. "David Brooks wasn't killed because someone got angry or drunk or whatever garbage theory you've got plastered on a whiteboard somewhere," he said coldly. "He was silenced." The detectives exchanged quick glances. Skepticism hung thick in the room, but at the same time, there was an undeniable grip of suspense. Michael had their attention now. "Silenced? For what?" Fletcher probed, his jaw tightening. "A story," Michael answered, a thin smile stretching across his lips. "Big enough to get him killed. That's how you know it's good, right? When someone's willing to dig a grave over it?" The room wasn't buying it, yet. Michael had a way of pulling people in, then spitting them out in the name of self-interest. But the implications of what he was saying couldn't be ignored. "He was working on something," Michael continued, confidence growing now that he'd planted the seed of intrigue. Something about the wrong people with the wrong connections. I don't know the full details, hell I didn't want to know, but what I do know is that he was sitting on evidence. Something dangerous, something corporate. Mark Yates inhaled sharply. This wasn't the first theory about David Brooks being murdered for an exposé, but the details were always too murky to confirm. Was Michael just recycling public information, or did he actually know something the others didn't? His notebook, Michael said, sensing the tension in the room. That's what they wanted. That little goddamn notebook he carried everywhere. That's what got him killed. Yates's mind began to churn on overdrive. This was the first time anyone had made a direct claim about the missing notebook, and Michael's specific mention of it sent alarms through his years of investigative instinct. "And who's they?" one of the Rangers asked, breaking the silence. Michael cocked his head, hesitation flashing across his face for the first time. "Two guys," he said slowly, as though deciding how much to reveal. One tall, real wiry, inked-up forearm, looked like a snake or something. The other one stocky, maybe 50 years old, walked with a limp. They weren't amateurs, I'll tell you that. "Names?" Yates pressed, leaning forward. Michael smirked, leaning back ever so slightly. "What's the fun in giving you everything at once? I might be dying, but I still like to keep the game interesting." Fletcher slammed a fist onto the table, his patience wearing thin. "Turner, we don't have time for these games. Give us what you know, now." Michael barely flinched at Fletcher's outburst. If anything, it fed his ego. "Calm down, Your Honor, I'm not trying to drag this out, I'll give you their names. But first, you'll need to know where to find the knife." The room stiffened. Everyone knew the murder weapon, the knife, had been one of the crucial missing pieces in the Brooks case. They'd suspected it might yield the DNA or fingerprints needed to blow the case wide open, but it had never been recovered. If Michael truly knew its location, he could shift the entire investigation in a direction it hadn't gone in years. Michael nonchalantly looked around the room, letting the weight of his claim settle. Then he spoke again. "It's in Denver," he said, his voice tinged with confidence. "Buried about 8 feet deep in a construction site just off Cherry Creek Drive. A building complex went up over it a couple of years ago. You'll have to do some digging, literally, but it's there. And you'll find prints on it that don't belong to me, just so we're clear." Yates scribbled furiously, trying to catch every piece of information. But the skepticism gnawed at him. Was Michael simply playing them, hoping to buy time with a manufactured confession? Or was this the breakthrough he'd spent 7 excruciating years waiting for? "And the names?" Yates asked again. Michael leaned back and smiled, almost as though enjoying the power he held over the room. "I'll tell you when the time is right. Can't put all my cards on the table now, can I?" The room buzzed with tension, a silent war waging between the disbelief in Michael's every syllable and the tantalizing slivers of truth wrapped in his words. If he was lying, it would be one of the most manipulative stunts ever pulled by a death row inmate. But if he was telling the truth, it would mean everything. Vindication for David Brooks, closure for his family, and justice for a life stolen too soon. Police reopened the case. The clock barely ticked past midnight when Detective Mark Yates stared at the stack of dusty files on his desk. The Brooks case was back, roaring like a ghost that had been waiting too long to be acknowledged. Outside his office, the Denver police station hummed with quiet activity. Officers on night shifts tapping away at keyboards, the distant murmur of police radios, lives being saved, or ruined, while Yates sat frozen in his chair. Michael Turner's testimony earlier that day had reignited something, the kind of spark that pulled a cop out of restless retirement into action. There was hesitation, sure. But there was also a lingering thought Mark couldn't shake. What if he's telling the truth? The Brooks case had been Yates' obsession for years. When David Brooks' bloodied body was discovered, Yates had vowed it wouldn't remain one of those cases that turned into unsolved whispers. But time wasn't kind to his promises. Leads evaporated, suspects drifted into alibis, and people he trusted in the department moved away to softer beats. The case hadn't been just cold, it had been frozen into irrelevance. And now, Michael Turner's confession cracked the ice. "Sergeant Yates," a familiar voice broke through his musing. It was Steve McConnell, his old partner, older now, with gray streaks thinning his once thick brown hair. "You gonna sit there staring at Brooks' file, or are we gonna talk about this?" McConnell leaned against the doorframe of Yates's office, arms crossed. Yates gestured to a chair. "You're not gonna believe what I heard today, Steve." "What? That Michael Turner's up for an Oscar in Manipulative Bastard of the Year?" McConnell shot back as he plopped into the chair across from Yates. "Why are we listening to him, huh? "Man's a psychopath playing mind games, he's wasting your time." Yates leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "He's playing, sure, but then he prattles off exact details about Brooks's notebook, details that were never released to the public. He mentioned the Cherry Creek Drive construction site, named it Steve. Do you remember that area?" McConnell sighed, his face softening a bit. "Hell yes, I remember Cherry Creek. The warehouses near there, we searched them for weeks, nothing but graffiti and rats. But no one knew where we suspected he might have been stabbed before being dumped. We never made any of that public. How would Michael know unless there's something to it?" Yates' voice gained an edge. "What if he's giving us the thread we couldn't find before?" McConnell gave a skeptical stare but didn't answer right away. Yates could tell he was reconsidering, playing the devil's advocate in his own mind. "All right," McConnell finally said. "Suppose he's not lying. What's the plan?" Yates smiled thinly. He loved it when Steve reluctantly agreed to come on board. "We're exhuming that construction site. If there's even a 1% chance that knife he mentioned is buried there, I'm digging it up." By mid-morning hours later, Yates stood in the orange glow of dawn at the construction site Michael Turner had mentioned. Cherry Creek Drive wasn't the neglected district it used to be. What once housed shadowy warehouses and urban decay had been revitalized into a neatly landscaped commercial complex. Glimmering office buildings stretched skyward, while nearby, a dog walker passed by with 3 golden retrievers in tow. It was almost wholesome, but Yates couldn't shake the unease in his gut. "Got the permits for this dig?" asked the foreman, a stout man named Carl who had been overseeing construction on the site for over a decade. "I don't need you worrying about permits," Yates replied curtly, flashing his badge for emphasis. The Denver PD had pulled plenty of strings to get an emergency excavation order signed overnight. Yates wasn't going to let red tape be the reason they didn't follow through. "Just keep your team out of our way." Carl raised both hands and muttered something about cops and bureaucracy, but he backed off. Soon, a small crew of uniformed officers began cordoning off the area around the main parking structure, exactly where Michael had claimed the knife was buried. "Who buries a murder weapon under a goddamn office complex?" McConnell muttered, standing next to Yates. "Maybe someone hoping it would never see daylight again," Yates replied, without looking away from the dig site. The air smelled of damp soil and freshly poured concrete as the rented backhoe bit into the ground. Minutes stretched into hours, and McConnell, ever impatient, fidgeted while Yates silently stewed in his thoughts. What if Michael had lied? What if there was nothing here? No knife, no evidence, no missing piece to the puzzle. Was he leading the department on a death row scavenger hunt for his own amusement? Yates's faith in the system had taken hits before, but Turner's smug smirk earlier that week gnawed at him. Michael didn't seem like someone who played cheap pranks. He was too methodical for that. "Detective!" one officer shouted, waving him over. Yates sprinted to the edge of the dig and crouched beside the man. The tip of rusted steel peeked out from the churned earth. With gloved hands, a forensic expert gingerly unearthed the object. A knife. The blade, though corroded, was still intact, a cruel curved thing that looked like it belonged in a hunter's arsenal. Etched along its brown handle were faint patterns, gritty with dirt but faintly visible. "Bag it!" Yates barked, motioning for the evidence techs to handle the knife. "They'll have to pull DNA," McConnell muttered, his skepticism rearing its head again. "Suppose it matches David Brooks. What does that even prove? You can't take Michael Turner's word alone to link this to the killers he described." "I know," Yates said, his voice low with tension, "but if we find prints, if any evidence matches the stories he gave us, I'm kicking every goddamn door I have to until we know the truth." By the time the DNA results came back, the news rippled through the Denver PD like wildfire. The blood on the knife belonged to David Brooks, just like Turner said, but the part that sent shockwaves through the department was the second piece of DNA, a match to a man named Robert Hayes, a known enforcer who had ties to organized crime. Hayes, as it turned out, had been arrested in 2018 on unrelated narcotics charges and was currently serving time in a federal prison. "You starting to believe your guy Turner now?" McConnell asked Yates as they stood before the DNA report. Yates didn't answer right away. He read the results over and over, his jaw set tight. Michael Turner's story was checking out in ways that made his skin crawl. What was Turner's angle? Was this all some chess move to manipulate the system? Or was he genuinely trying to bring another murderer to light? Either way, Yates knew the investigation couldn't stop here. Not now. "Get the paperwork ready," Yates finally said. "We need to question Hayes." "And Turner?" McConnell asked. Yates looked out the window, the city skyline glinting in the late afternoon sun. "We'll deal with Turner when the time comes. For now, let's find out how deep this rabbit hole goes." Evidence and DNA under the light of truth. The forensic lab was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of computers and the rustle of papers being shuffled by lab technicians. Detective Mark Yates stood near the edge of the sterile, brightly lit room, his arms crossed, staring down at the faxed DNA report in his hands. He had read it 3 times already, but the implications still hadn't entirely sunk in. "Say it again!" Yates called out to the forensic tech at the far end of the lab, his voice clipped, tense. "Lay it out for me one more time." The tech, a wiry man named Ethan Chen with glasses perpetually sliding down the bridge of his nose, turned from his station and adjusted his gloves before speaking. "Detective, to put it plainly, we've got a match." He held up the printed results as if to emphasize gravity. "The blood on the knife is an exact match to David Brooks' DNA profile from the original crime scene evidence. That curved blade buried in the construction site, it's the murder weapon you've been looking for." Yates exhaled, a small weight leaving his chest, but only a small one. He nodded slowly. "And the second sample?" His voice dropped an octave, almost as though he was bracing for the answer. Chen cleared his throat before responding. "The second DNA profile doesn't belong to Michael Turner, it belongs to someone else, a man named Robert Hayes." He stepped forward, holding out another folder filled with relevant documents. "Hayes' DNA is already in the federal database because he's currently serving time in New Mexico on drug trafficking and weapons charges." "Him?" Yates muttered, flipping through the documents, his brow furrowing as he spotted Hayes' mugshot printed alongside his criminal history. "Damn, I've heard his name before. Organized crime enforcer, right? Used to intimidate people for some sleazebag corporate types back in the day, extortion, threats, you name it. That's the guy," Chen confirmed, "and his DNA is on the handle of the knife, along with Brooks' blood. If this turns into a trial, it's pretty damning evidence." Yates sank into a nearby chair, the winds of triumph tempered by a lingering storm of questions. This was a monumental breakthrough in the Brooks case. After 7 years of stone-cold silence, the puzzle finally had pieces falling into place. But why now? Why had this evidence come from Michael Turner, a convicted murderer on death row with no apparent ties to Denver or Brooks? And what possible role did Hayes play in silencing the journalist? Steve McConnell appeared in the doorway of the lab, his usual scowl softened for once into a subtle look of curiosity. "You've been holed up in here an hour. Finally get something good?" "Oh yeah," Yates replied without looking up, throwing the folder toward McConnell, who caught it midair. "Turns out Michael Turner wasn't full of crap this time. The knife we dug up, Brooks' blood is on it. And better yet, Hayes' DNA is all over the handle." McConnell opened the folder and scanned the results, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "Hayes," he murmured. "Jesus, that guy's been untouchable for years. Even when we've had him, he always had people making deals or tying cases up in procedural knots. If he was involved in Brooks' murder..." He trailed off and looked back at Yates. "You're not thinking this connects to something bigger, are you?" "Bigger?" Yates echoed, leaning forward in his chair as though the thought had been gnawing at him all morning. "That's exactly what I'm thinking. Look at Hayes. This guy doesn't act unless someone's calling the shots. He's muscle, not the brains. Which makes me wonder why anybody wanted Brooks dead in the first place." "You're saying this wasn't just a hit, it was political," McConnell said slowly, his voice tinged with dread. "Or corporate," Yates suggested, recalling Michael Turner's cryptic comments during his emergency meeting with the judge and investigators. Turner said Brooks was sitting on something dangerous, something corporate. He wasn't a random target, somebody wanted that notebook, his evidence, erased, and they were willing to get Hayes involved to do it. The implications hit them both like a lead weight. Hayes' connection to organized crime with corporate clients wasn't new, but tying him to Brooks's murder could unveil layers of hidden motives no one had even dared to look for. After all, David Brooks wasn't just a journalist. He was a relentless whistleblower. His stories had exposed dirty deals, political corruption, and unchecked greed across industries most reporters wouldn't dare to touch. Whatever he was working on before his death, it was powerful enough to cost him his life. Within hours, Yates and McConnell were seated in the warden's cramped office at Highland Creek Correctional Facility. The lab results had expedited a request to speak with Michael Turner again, though the conversation would inevitably be another game of give and take. "So," McConnell began with his usual deadpan delivery as Michael was escorted into the room in shackles, "looks like you weren't making it all up after all. We found the knife. It matches the Brooks murder. DNA on the handle ties it to Hayes. Now I don't know if that makes you lucky, clever, or just a very good liar, but it means we're listening." Michael sat down casually, the cuffs on his wrists clinking as he leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Told you I wasn't just pulling crap out of thin air. When you sit long enough in a place like this," he gestured vaguely to the penitentiary walls enclosing them, "you collect things, information, especially about guys like Hayes." Yates leaned in, his gaze sharp, cutting through Michael's nonchalant demeanor. "All right, Turner, enough games. Hayes' DNA puts him at the scene of Brooks's murder, so now's your chance to lay it out. What's the deal? Why kill Brooks? Who gave the order?" Michael's smirk didn't waver. "You guys are asking the right questions, finally. But here's the thing. I didn't say Hayes acted alone." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You think a guy like Hayes just gets up one day and decides to whack a journalist for fun? Nah, this goes higher up. He's not the puppet master." "Who is?" McConnell snapped, frustration seeping through his normally calm tone. "You figure that out," Michael said with a shrug. "I've given you enough to keep you busy. Besides, if I just handed you the answers, what fun would that be? The truth, you'll have to dig for it yourself." Yates leaned back, his teeth grinding as he fought the urge to lash out. Turner wasn't going to make this easy, but that was no surprise. What mattered now was placing every piece of evidence under a microscope, building the paper trail to expose whoever had ordered Hayes to silence David Brooks. Back at headquarters, the case blew wide open as detectives poured through cold files and cross-referenced Hayes' connections, memos, financial records, phone calls. A pattern started forming. Hayes had worked security for an oil and gas corporation under scrutiny a decade earlier, one that Brooks had heavily investigated before his death. Motives bubbled to the surface: insider corruption, whistleblowing, dirty deals potentially tied to Brooks' murder. These weren't just theories anymore, they were facts waiting to be uncovered. "Turner's not lying," Yates muttered late into the night, slamming shut yet another file. "This isn't just a murder, it's a cover-up. Brooks got too close to something and they made sure he wouldn't talk. Now," McConnell added grimly, "we just need to figure out how many layers this thing's got, and whether Hayes is willing to crack under pressure." Yates nodded. It wasn't just about solving a 7-year-old case anymore. It was about pulling a thread that could unravel something enormous and dangerous. A new suspect and an unexpected motive. The walls of the Denver Police Department's conference room were festooned with maps, timelines, and case files. The air in the room carried the faint smell of stale coffee, a testament to the long hours invested in dissecting Michael Turner's testimony and the new revelations tied to Robert Hayes. Faced with a name as infamous as Hayes, the room buzzed with a mix of adrenaline and unease. Detectives shuffled papers, some leaning against walls, others crowding around the central whiteboard as Detective Mark Yates scrawled the enforcer's name in bold at the center. "Robert Hayes," Yates began, uncapping a fresh marker. "Former Marine, dishonorable discharge. Became a known enforcer for criminal networks up and down the western United States. His specialty?" Yates underlined the name with a sharp swipe. "Silencing people permanently. You needed someone disappeared. Hayes was your guy. Clean, efficient, and tough to pin down in court." Steve McConnell, leaning against the edge of the conference table with a skeptical smirk, exhaled slowly. "We've had Hayes slip through our fingers before. A couple of decades worth of charges. From extortion to assault, nothing sticks. The guy's a damn ghost." He nodded toward the mugshot taped to the whiteboard. Hayes' face stared back, a chiseled jawline, cold, dead eyes, and a surgical scar running from his left temple to his jawline. "You think this guy's behind David Brooks' murder? That's next level even for him." "Not just Hayes," Yates corrected, turning to address the room. His tone sharpened in a way that silenced the murmurs. "Here's what we know. Brooks wasn't some unlucky civilian in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was silenced because of whatever story he was working on. Michael Turner made that crystal clear. And Hayes isn't the mastermind, he's just the knife in the dark. Someone else gave the orders, someone pulling strings." A junior detective raised a hand hesitantly. "Do we have any leads on who that might be?" Yates let the question hang for a moment, pacing around the room, rolling the marker in his hand. "You don't hire a guy like Hayes unless there's a hell of a lot at stake," he began. "Turner hinted that this goes corporate. Hayes didn't act alone, and I'll bet my badge that David Brooks had uncovered something so explosive that someone high up in the food chain decided he needed to be silenced." "Corporate?" McConnell interjected with disbelief. "You're saying some CEO or top executive decided to hire a thug like Hayes and have a journalist murdered? That feels like it should have made headlines by now. That's because they're good at staying clean, Yates snapped. Whoever it is, they've kept their hands spotless while people like Hayes handle the ugly work. The deeper the team dug, the darker the web became. Phone records, financial statements, and old reports were pulled from Brooks' investigation files. One name started creeping into the case more than once: Seraph Energy Corporation, a multinational oil and gas firm embroiled in a series of regulatory scandals in the years before Brooks's death. Seraph Energy, Yates muttered, pointing to a name written in red on the board, flanked by dollar signs and dates. Brooks had been investigating them for over a year before his death. Allegations of illegal dumping, bribery, regulatory cover-ups, you name it. My guess? Brooks found something he wasn't supposed to. Jesus, McConnell muttered, flipping through one of Brooks's old articles titled Energy Giants or Untouchable Thugs. This guy didn't pull punches, did he? Brooks wasn't just digging for dirt, Yates continued, his tone hardening. He was about to ruin lives, fortunes, entire legacies. Whoever it was inside Seraph Energy, someone stood to lose a lot, and I'd bet my paycheck they paid Hayes to handle their reporter problem. Michael Turner wasn't lying when he said Hayes wasn't alone. Piecing together connections between Seraph Energy's records and the people they hired brought new faces into focus. An executive named Arthur Levington began to stand out like a glaring red flag. Arthur Levington, Yates announced, pinning a photo onto the whiteboard. Levington's face was round, polished, and utterly forgettable, the kind of man you'd pass by on the street without a second thought. Former chief of security for Seraph Energy, the guy technically worked in logistics, but dig a little deeper? He was managing shadow contracts. One of them flagged a security retainer for Robert Hayes the same month Brooks was killed. You telling me this stiff was Hayes' boss? McConnell barked, throwing his pen onto the table. He doesn't look like the kind of guy barking orders at a killer. That's the thing, Yates replied with a grim smile. People like Levington don't sign off on murder, not on paper. They just clear obstacles. Hayes connects to Seraph through Levington, but let's be real. Levington's probably just passing orders along. He's middle management. Somewhere above him, that's where we find the real target. Late that night, sitting in his dimly lit office with the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead, Yates rifled through more of David Brooks's old notes. Photocopies of blurry receipts tucked into files referenced meetings with anonymous whistleblowers. Scrawled in the margins of one notebook was a cryptic comment: "If I disappear, it's Seraph. Check 8/12, the network." The network? Yates read aloud, frowning. The phrasing was vague, but had the ominous ring of a broader conspiracy. He glanced at the date, August 12, the night Brooks was last seen alive. "What the hell were you getting at, David?" The phrase stuck in Yates's head like a needle lodged in a record. As the forensic analysts pulled more metadata from Brooks's text messages and emails, one correspondence in particular stood out. It was from an anonymous sender, warning him to stop digging into Seraph Energy and referencing a meeting just hours before Brooks was murdered. The digital trail, while faint, showed Brooks arranging to meet someone near the industrial zone where he was later found. Someone lured him there, McConnell concluded, staring at the map. He didn't stumble into an ambush. This was premeditated. Yates nodded, his jaw tightening. Hayes might have done the killing, but the motive came from higher up. Seraph Energy isn't just a suspect now. They've officially got blood on their hands. As every piece fell into place, Yates realized the stakes. This wasn't about solving a murder anymore. It was about unraveling a network of power and corruption so entrenched that it had remained hidden for years. Hayes had been nothing more than a hired gun. Levington, a bureaucratic pawn. The real question now wasn't just who ordered Brooks's death, it was how far were they willing to go to keep their secrets buried. And with Michael Turner still holding on to parts of the story, Yates knew one thing for certain: the answers they needed weren't going to come easy. Inconsistencies in the death row inmate story. The interrogation room was suffused with tension, its only occupants locked in an uneasy dance of words and suspicion. Detective John Carter, a man infamous within the force for his steel-trap mind and unflinching demeanor, sat across the table from Michael Turner. On the glossy metal table between them lay a stack of files, a cup of untouched coffee, and a single recording device that blinked red steadily. Michael, ever calm and calculating, leaned back in his chair, hands cuffed in his lap, his expression a portrait of subtle arrogance. "You know, Turner," Carter began, his voice low and deliberate, "I've seen a lot of guys like you, smooth talkers who think 10 steps ahead, proud of their game, but you know what they all have in common?" He paused, his piercing gaze locked on Michael. "They always get sloppy." Michael smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sloppy, huh? Never been accused of that before, Detective. You can ask around." Carter didn't smile. Instead, he opened one of the files in front of him and slid a photograph across the table. The image, a close-up shot of the murder weapon, the curved knife buried at Cherry Creek Drive, was partially obscured with dirt and rust. "Let's talk about this knife," Carter said coldly. "You told us it was buried 8 feet down at the construction site. You said we'd find it right where you described, and sure enough, we did. But here's where it gets interesting, Turner." Michael tilted his head slightly, feigning curiosity as if Carter's words amused him. "Do tell." "This knife has DNA on the handle, your pal Robert Hayes' DNA, just like you said," Carter continued, leaning forward slightly. His voice sharpened, each word hitting like a hammer on steel. "But what you didn't say, or maybe what you didn't know, is that we also found fingerprints. Prints that don't belong to Hayes, prints that don't belong to Brooks. Prints, interestingly enough, that don't match anyone in our database." For the first time, a flicker of something unspoken crossed Michael's face. Surprise maybe, annoyance. It came and went so fast it was almost imperceptible. Carter didn't let up. "So tell me, Turner, how does your story account for that? Because last time I checked, ghost fingerprints don't exactly bury murder weapons." Michael chuckled softly, leaning forward now as if both men were sharing some private joke. "Maybe your database just isn't as solid as you think. You ever consider that, Detective?" Carter ignored the jab. He reached for another photo, this one showing a comparison of tire tracks found at the Cherry Creek site. "And then there's this," Carter said, placing the evidence inches from Michael. "Tire prints. We matched them to construction vehicles. But there are inconsistencies. A second set of tracks, fainter, older, belong to a personal vehicle. You wouldn't happen to remember what kind of car Robert Hayes drove, would you?" Michael shrugged, his smirk fading slightly. "When I knew Hayes, he switched vehicles like he switched moods. Guy wasn't exactly sentimental." Carter nodded slowly, letting the silence linger just long enough for the air to feel heavy. Then, with calculated precision, he flipped open another folder, a log of Michael's phone calls made from prison. "This is where things really start falling apart, Turner. One of my guys pulled prison records over the last 6 months. You made 15 calls to the same phone number in Denver," Carter said, tapping the log for emphasis. "A burner. And backtracked from that burner? A landline tied to a Seraph energy office." Michael's demeanor stiffened, his fingers tensing against his handcuffed wrists. It was subtle, but Carter didn't miss it. "You're going to sit here and tell me," Carter pressed, his voice laced with venom, "that you had nothing to do with Seraph Energy, with Brooks' murder, because it sure as hell looks like you were coordinating your little bedtime stories with someone on the outside." Michael finally leaned back, exhaling as though Carter's accusation barely fazed him. "Detective, you're reaching here. Sounds like someone else is using me as their patsy. You think I'm running prison-time conspiracies with a phone card? Come on, be smarter than that." "See, Turner, that right there is what makes me curious," Carter shot back, eyes narrowed. "For a guy who claims he's doing this for justice, you sure love keeping secrets." Meanwhile, in another corner of the investigation, Sergeant Mark Yates and Steve McConnell were conducting their own probe, sifting through every piece of evidence Michael had provided. As they dug deeper into Turner's claims, the inconsistencies piled up like stacks of mismatched puzzle pieces. "Something's off about this guy," McConnell muttered, holding up a photocopy of Michael's written testimony. "Look at this. He says Hayes buried the knife by himself after the job, but then here," he jabbed a finger at a paragraph, "he says there were 2 other people watching Brooks when it all went down. Which is it? Was Hayes flying solo, or were there witnesses?" Yates rubbed the bridge of his nose, fatigue creeping into his voice. "And then there's the damn timeline. Turner says he was in Denver that night, but there's zero proof outside his own word. No records, no sightings, no tickets logged within 300 miles of where Brooks was killed. It's like he materialized out of thin air." "Which makes me wonder how," McConnell added. "If Turner's lying about being a witness, then where is he pulling these details from? He's not psychic, so where'd he get the knowledge?" Back in the interrogation room, Carter wasn't letting up. The man was relentless, cutting into Michael's story like a surgeon wielding a knife. "Let me guess," Carter barked, the edge in his tone razor sharp. "You've heard enough loose talk in prison to piece this thing together, haven't you? That's your ticket, isn't it? Drop enough truth to make you look valuable, then twist the rest to suit your needs." Michael's silence was louder than any answer he could have given. Carter stood, shoving his chair back and pacing for the first time since the questioning had begun. "You didn't come clean about Brooks because you felt guilty or because you wanted to help," Carter spat, glaring across the room. "You just needed a lifeline, a distraction to stall your time on death row." Michael smirked again, though this time it was thinner, less confident. "If that's what you want to believe, Detective, who am I to stop you?" Outside the room, Yates, watching the interrogation through the one-way glass, shook his head grimly. "He's lying," he muttered to McConnell, who stood with his arms crossed. "He's lying, and I think he dragged Hayes and Seraph into this on purpose." McConnell grunted. "You think Turner's smart enough to manipulate a corporation and a criminal like Hayes simultaneously?" "No," Yates replied quietly, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Michael's motionless figure. "But I think he's desperate enough to try. Signs of forgery, and the real motive." The Denver Police Department's evidence room buzzed with quiet intensity, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly as Detective Mark Yates combed through a mountain of documents. Beside him, Steve McConnell flipped through pages of Michael Turner's prison records, his thick eyebrows furrowed in concentration. The air felt heavy, like something about to break open, a case on the brink of revelation. McConnell broke the silence first, holding up a set of papers with a slight sneer. "Mark, you gotta see this," he said, shaking the papers for emphasis. "Turner's been pulling stunts long before he landed on death row. Check out these letters." Yates turned, his focus shifting to McConnell, who tossed the papers onto the nearby table. The top page was an official-looking letter stamped with the seal of the Texas State Board of Pardon and Parole. "Jesus," Yates muttered, as his eyes scanned the paper. "What am I looking at here?" "Notice the font's off?" McConnell pointed to the header while grabbing another document from the pile. "This is what an actual parole letter looks like. We got it from a previous case. Turner sent this forgery to his lawyer back in 2020, acting like the board was reconsidering his appeal. It's all fake, top to bottom." Yates let out an exasperated laugh, more disbelief than amusement. "He forged a goddamn state document? From death row?" "Doesn't stop there," McConnell said, slapping down another file. "This one's a set of emails, fake evidence logs he submitted through his appeals process. Claimed the prosecution tampered with DNA, even planted evidence. It's all complete bull." Yates whistled low, shaking his head. "This guy's something else. You're telling me he was orchestrating all this from a prison cell?" "Some of it, yeah." McConnell leaned back in his chair, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "He's been building this whole act for years, trying to paint himself as the victim of a corrupt system." "And yet," Yates said quietly, his brow furrowing as he trailed off. He grabbed Michael Turner's confession transcript from across the table, tapping it against the surface. "Some of the details he gave us about Brooks, they still check out, like the knife, like Hayes. So where's the line with this guy? What's real and what's just another piece of his game?" A few hours later, Yates and McConnell found themselves back in the interrogation room with the man of the hour. Michael Turner sat with a faint smirk, his hands cuffed to the table. The cuffs clinked softly as he shifted in his seat, his composure unshaken despite the stack of evidence Yates had just slammed down between them. "Well, well," Michael began, his tone almost conversational, like he was catching up with old friends. "Detectives, back for more? I was starting to think you forgot about me." "Cut the crap, Turner," Yates snapped, pulling up a chair across from him. "You've been playing games since day one, and we're done dancing around it. Let's talk about all the forgeries." Michael arched an eyebrow in mock surprise. "Forgeries? That's a big word, Detective. Care to elaborate?" Yates chuckled bitterly, flipping open the file. He pulled out the fake parole letter and slid it across the table. "Recognize this?" Michael glanced down, his smirk widening. "Ah, yes, my greatest hits. What can I say? When the system's broken, you have to get creative." "That's your excuse?" McConnell growled from his post near the corner. "Forging state documents, faking DNA evidence, wasting resources on fabricated appeals. You think all this makes you innocent?" "Innocent?" Michael repeated, leaning forward, his cuffs scraping against the table. "Detective, I've never claimed to be innocent, but I've claimed to be smart, and maybe a step ahead of you." "Smart enough to get caught," Yates shot back flatly. "Caught?" Michael chuckled darkly. "Look around, Detective, I'm on death row. What more can you do to me? You think one more forgery charge changes my odds? You think I'm here feeding you breadcrumbs because I care about the law?" Yates leaned forward, matching Michael's intensity. "No, I think you're feeding us breadcrumbs because you're hiding something bigger, something you don't want us to find. Let's talk about Hayes and that knife." "That knife," Michael repeated, his voice dropping slightly. "You found it, didn't you? Right where I said it would be. So remind me, Mark, why are we even here? I gave you your smoking gun." "Yeah, and the ballistic report checks out," Yates admitted coolly. "It's the murder weapon. Brooks' blood, Hayes' DNA. But the problem isn't whether the knife is real, Turner. It's how the hell you knew where it was. Michael shrugged lazily. Maybe I'm a psychic. Don't tell the other inmates, I wouldn't want my reputation to suffer. Or maybe, Yates said, his voice hardening, you orchestrated this whole story long before you opened your mouth. Maybe you knew we'd find Hayes, and maybe you thought pinning this on some bigger corporate conspiracy would distract us from the glaring truth. Michael's smirk faltered, just barely, but it was enough for Yates to push harder. What was the real angle with Brooks? Yates barked. You wanted us to chase Seraph energy, didn't you? You wanted us sniffing up a tree full of powerful people so we'd stop looking at you, so we'd let our guard down while you played the long con. Long con? Michael repeated softly, as if tasting the words. He leaned back, his smirk returning, but there was something forced about it now. Detective, you flatter me. But if you've already made up your mind, why are we even talking? McConnell cut in. Because here's what we know, Turner. You're a damn good manipulator, but you're not good enough to cover your tracks completely. Those calls to Denver, those forgeries, they all point to one thing. You're running this smoke and mirrors act to cover your own ass. So either you tell us why Brooks was really killed, or we'll find out without you. Michael exhaled slowly, his smirk finally fading into something closer to honesty, or maybe fatigue. You want the truth? He asked quietly, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. That's the idea, Yates replied flatly. The truth is, Brooks wasn't supposed to die, Michael said, his gaze dropping to the table. He was collateral. Hayes fucked it up. The whole job was supposed to be about getting that notebook of his, wiping his work off the map. Instead, Hayes panicked. And Seraph? They don't lose sleep over a collateral. But me? I've been losing sleep ever since. You're saying you were part of the plan? Yates pressed, his voice razor sharp. I'm saying there's no plan anymore, Detective, Michael replied, his voice darkening. Not for Brooks, not for me, just loose ends, and you're standing in mine. Psychological showdown in the interrogation room. The room was a box of pressure. Every inch of it seemed designed to grind down whoever was seated inside. The gray walls, the harsh fluorescent light, the unyielding metal table, all of it created an atmosphere where truth felt unavoidable and lies felt suffocating. Michael Turner sat coolly in his chair, the clink of his handcuffs echoing faintly as he shifted slightly. Across from him sat Detective John Carter, a man who had built a reputation on peeling lies apart layer by layer. Carter's presence felt heavy, like he was a physical manifestation of justice itself, patient but unrelenting. For a moment neither of them spoke. Carter stared at Michael like he wanted to bore a hole straight through his skull. Michael met his gaze, his expression relaxed, arrogant even, as though he were daring Carter to try. On the table between them sat a folder stuffed with damning evidence, yet somehow Michael sat as though he was the one holding all the cards. You know, Carter began softly, leaning back in his chair. Every time you open your mouth, Turner, I can feel my blood pressure spike. He smirked faintly, but the edge in his voice made it clear this wasn't a joke. You're good at weaving stories, I'll give you that. Most guys in your position panic, sputter, trip over their words, but not you. You like the game, don't you? Michael tilted his head slightly, studying Carter the way a poker player might study an opponent who had just raised the stakes. Game's only fun if the competition's worth it, he replied smoothly. And you, Detective? You've been entertaining. Funny. Carter chuckled darkly, tapping his fingers on the edge of the table. Because I'm not here to entertain you, Michael. I'm here to end this circus of yours. All your lies, your half-truths about Hayes, your cryptic little hints about Seraph energy, your sob story about collateral damage. He leaned forward now, his voice sharpening into something razor-thin and dangerous. I'm not buying it anymore. None of it. Michael's smirk widened as though he were truly amused, but the glint in his eyes suggested otherwise. You're upset, Carter. I can see it. Feel it, even. That's the thing about guys like you. You wear your frustration like cheap cologne. Me? I wear confidence. He tapped his temple with a cuffed finger. Because I know I'm smarter than whatever game you think you're playing. Carter leaned in as well, their faces now inches apart. Oh, you think you're smarter than me, Turner? Let's test that theory. Without breaking eye contact, Carter reached into the folder and pulled out a printed phone log. He slapped it down on the table, the paper sliding right into Michael's line of sight. This right here, Carter began, his voice steady but laced with fire, is a record of every call you made from prison over the last 6 months. 15 different calls to a burner in Denver. And that burner? It's tied to a landline registered to Seraph Energy. Funny how that keeps coming up. Care to explain? Michael's smirk faltered ever so slightly, so slight Carter almost missed it but not quite. "Go ahead," Carter pressed, his tone relentless. "Spin me another one of your pretty little stories. Tell me why a guy rotting away on death row is burning up the phone lines with some corporate titan's office." Michael chuckled softly, though it lacked the heat of his earlier confidence. "You ever consider," he began slowly, dragging out the words, "that maybe I'm not the guy you think I am? Maybe Seraph Energy just likes to keep tabs on someone like me. Can you blame them? I've got the kind of information that makes their lawyers sweat through their suits." Carter slammed a fist on the table, the noise reverberating through the small room. "Cut the crap, Turner," he barked, his patience dangling by a thread. "You didn't start talking about Brooks, the knife, or Hayes out of the goodness of your heart. What are you hiding? What's your angle?" Michael sat back, his composure returning as quickly as it had slipped away. He studied Carter carefully, his expression almost mockingly thoughtful. "Detective," he said finally, his voice silky smooth but devoid of sincerity, "you make it sound like I'm the villain here, like I wanted Brooks dead. Aren't you supposed to be the one chasing facts, not feelings?" Carter's nostrils flared. "Oh, I've got facts, Turner. I've got Hayes' DNA on the murder weapon. I've got phone calls tying you to a company full of corrupt executives. Hell, I've even got inconsistencies in your statement so big I could drive a truck through them." He leaned in again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But what I don't have yet, I don't have why. Why would you, someone already sentenced to die, stick your neck out for Hayes, for Seraph, or is it the other way around? Were they pulling the strings, or were you?" "Now that's an interesting question," Michael replied, seemingly unfazed. He raised his cuffed hands slightly, gesturing toward Carter. "But here's the thing, Detective. You're focusing on the wrong details. You think this is about why?" He leaned forward, a ghost of a grin sliding back onto his face. "It's about time." Carter frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" "Time," Michael repeated casually. "I'm not thinking about why Brooks died. That's ancient history. I'm thinking about now, about today, about every second that ticks by while you're stuck in this room trying to outsmart me. Tell me, Carter, what's your next move? Because mine's already 3 steps ahead." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. Carter's jaw tightened as he tried to keep his frustration in check. He had seen interrogations devolve into games of cat and mouse before, but this was different. Turner wasn't just stonewalling, he was enjoying the chaos, feeding off it. "You think you're buying yourself time?" Carter asked finally. "What, a few weeks, a month? All you're doing is delaying the inevitable." Michael's grin turned predatory. "Detective, you're assuming that time is working against me. What if it isn't? What if every second you spend chasing me in circles is a second someone else gets to clean up the mess?" "What mess?" Carter shot back, his tone brimming with frustration. But Michael didn't answer. He simply leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but undeniably self-satisfied. It was clear he wasn't going to give Carter anything substantial, not without a fight. Outside the interrogation room, Yates and McConnell stood behind the one-way glass, observing the exchange in silence. "He's toying with us," McConnell muttered, his voice low. "He's feeding us just enough to keep us chasing our tails." "He's hiding something bigger," Yates replied, his gaze never leaving Michael. "This isn't just about Brooks. It's not just some corporate cover-up. Turner's got a bigger play here, and we're not seeing it yet." McConnell turned to Yates, frowning. "Then what the hell do we do? Keep pushing him?" "No," Yates said firmly. His eyes narrowed as a thought began to take root. "If Turner wants to play chess, fine. But he doesn't get to be the only one thinking 3 moves ahead." The truth revealed. The courtroom was buzzing, a steady hum of whispers and clicking pens echoing under the vaulted ceiling. The air was heavy with a mix of anticipation and dread. Michael Turner, clad in his prison orange, sat quietly at the defense table. His posture was confident, too confident, like a man who knew the weight of the room revolved around him. But this time, unlike the countless others when he felt like the puppet master, something in the air had shifted. Detective John Carter was seated on the witness stand, his face as stone-cold as ever. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room before locking onto Turner. Across the aisle, prosecutors were flipping through files, organizing evidence that was about to hit the courtroom like a bombshell. A federal judge presided, her gavel resting ominously near her hand. The truth, it seemed, was moments away from bursting open. Assistant District Attorney Melinda Parks stood, walking slowly towards the jury. She set her legal pad down and took a deep breath, her sharp gaze darting briefly to Turner, who returned it with a faint sneer. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but with an undeniable edge of intensity, "you've heard a lot in these last few weeks. Stories, counter-stories, testimony from a man whose guilt in one murder is already a certainty and whose role in another tragedy has left us all wondering." She gestured toward Turner without looking at him. "What is truth, and what is manipulation?" Turner smirked faintly, leaning back in his seat as though Parks were performing just for him. "Well," Parks continued, her voice sharpening, "the time for wondering is over. Today we will connect every piece of this puzzle, the murder of journalist David Brooks, the tangled lies spun by Michael Turner, and the shadowy corporate players standing behind him." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Detective Mark Yates to the stand." Yates entered from the back of the courtroom, his tall frame commanding attention as he strode toward the witness box. He took his seat, adjusted the mic, and leaned forward slightly, the kind of posture that suggested he was prepared to hit hard and play smart. "Detective Yates," Parks began, "you've been investigating this case for how long?" "7 years, Yates replied, keeping his tone even. "Ever since David Brooks' murder in 2015. "And how did this investigation evolve after Michael Turner's testimony last month?" Yates leaned slightly closer to the microphone, his eyes narrowing across the courtroom toward Turner. "His testimony marked a turning point. At first we thought he was just a desperate death row inmate trying to buy time. But elements of his story, details about the knife, about Robert Hayes, about Seraph Energy, were too accurate to ignore." He paused. "And that's when the real picture began to form." "Let's break it down," Parks said, pacing slightly. "Michael Turner claimed he witnessed David Brooks' murder at the hands of Robert Hayes, hired for the job by someone higher up in Seraph Energy. Is that correct?" "Yes," Yates affirmed. "Turner initially framed himself as merely a bystander, a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He described Brooks's murder as a professional hit, orchestrated to cut off the investigation Brooks was pursuing." "And what did the investigation reveal about Turner's involvement that differed from his claims?" Yates took a breath, his voice steady but loaded with gravity. "Michael Turner wasn't just a witness, he was a participant. He wasn't at the wrong place at the wrong time, he was part of the operation." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Turner's smirk tightened for a fraction of a second, but then it re-emerged, colder this time. His hands rested calmly on the table, his eyes never leaving Yates. "Detective," Parks prompted, her voice gaining momentum, "walk us through how you unveiled the truth." Yates nodded. "There were inconsistencies in Turner's testimony, small details that didn't sit right. For one, he claimed Hayes buried the knife alone, but we recovered tire tracks from a secondary vehicle at the Cherry Creek construction site. Those weren't part of Hayes' truck. They matched a vehicle Michael Turner rented 3 days before the murder." Parks raised her eyebrows, turning toward the jury. "You're saying Turner not only knew where the knife was buried, but actively participated in concealing it?" "That's right," Yates replied firmly. "Michael Turner actively helped Hayes hide the murder weapon, and based on phone logs from the prison, it's clear he was in communication with what we're calling the middlemen, executives inside Seraph Energy who coordinated the operation." Parks's voice rose slightly, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "So you're saying Turner wasn't a bystander, he was a co-conspirator?" "Exactly," Yates stated, his gaze darting toward Turner again. "Turner acted as a go-between. His role wasn't just to keep his hands clean, it was to make sure the job stayed hidden. Hayes was the muscle. The orders came from higher up at Seraph, but Turner, he was the buffer." The jury exchanged glances, the weight of Yates's words sinking into the room like lead. Back at the defense table, Turner shifted slightly, his smirk faltering for just a second. He adjusted his cuffs, glanced toward his attorney, and then back at the prosecution. For the first time in days that smug demeanor had cracked, revealing a flicker of unease. When Parks stepped back toward her desk, she retrieved a thin, sealed envelope. Turning to the judge, she asked, "Your Honor, permission to submit new evidence, item 74? Judge Barringer nodded. "You may proceed." As Parks unfolded the document inside, her expression hardened. "Detective Yates," she said, "this is an email recovered from Seraph Energy's internal server, dated August 11th, 2015, the day before David Brooks was killed. Could you summarize its contents?" Yates leaned forward and skimmed the document projected onto a screen for the courtroom. "It's an internal memo from Arthur Levington, the former director of security for Seraph. The email discusses removing interference from Brooks' investigation and references a team already lined up for the job, specifically listing Robert Hayes by name." "And Turner?" Parks pressed. "Is he mentioned?" "He isn't mentioned directly," Yates admitted. But phone records confirmed that Turner made a series of calls to Levington's office during that same week. Parks approached the jury again, her every motion deliberate and sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a crime built on layers of deceit. Michael Turner has tried to paint himself as a man caught in the crossfire. His lies were calculated, meant to protect him from the inevitable. But make no mistake, he was in the middle of this from the start. A willing accomplice to murder. When the gavel finally rang out, signaling the adjournment of court for the day, the buzz in the room was deafening. Reporters scrambled to take notes as Turner was escorted out by bailiffs. But this time, his posture wasn't as cocky. The cracks in his control were showing now, crooked edges of a master manipulator caught in his own game. Outside the courthouse, Yates stood next to McConnell, both of them watching the press swarm toward the steps. "This bastard's done," McConnell muttered, blowing out a breath. "It's over." Yates didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on the retreating form of Michael Turner, chains jingling as he disappeared behind the courthouse doors. "Almost," Yates said quietly. "But something tells me this fight isn't over yet." The courtroom's final chapter. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that was louder than any noise. The air spiraled with tension, thick enough to choke anyone sitting in that room. It had been weeks of heated arguments, endless evidence presentations, and grilling cross-examinations. And now, everyone was ready for the final showdown. This wasn't just another trial, it had become a spectacle that gripped the nation. Journalists were packed into the benches, their pens poised like weapons. Michael Turner sat at the defense table, his expression stoic, almost resigned. Gone was the cocky smirk and faux confidence. For the first time since his trial began, he looked small, skin stretched tightly across his cheekbones, his once defiant posture now slumped. "Court is now in session," Judge Barringer declared, her voice firm and steady. The sound of her gavel echoed through the room like a starter pistol, signaling the beginning of the end. ADA Melinda Parks stood from her seat, legal pad in hand. Her steps toward the jury were measured, deliberate, refusing to rush what was about to happen. This moment wasn't just for the prosecution or law enforcement, it was for the Parker family, the Brooks family, and every victim silenced by unchecked corruption and greed. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Parks began, her voice striking the perfect balance of warmth and conviction. She projected power. "The evidence you've seen in this courtroom tells a story, but it's not just Michael Turner's story. It's the story of Emily Parker, whose life was stolen by the man sitting right there. A man who showed no remorse for what he did." She pointed toward Turner, and her voice hardened ever so slightly. "It's also the story of David Brooks, a journalist murdered because he threatened a powerful corporation's empire. And—" she paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Michael Turner is the connection between those two crimes." Michael didn't flinch, but his eyes flickered ever so slightly toward Parks. He was listening, no matter how much he tried to appear disinterested. Parks took a deep breath. "Over these past weeks, you've seen how Turner tried to play both sides. He painted himself as a victim, a simple man caught up in forces greater than himself, but piece by piece we have shown that narrative for what it is, a lie." She turned her gaze directly to the jury now, her voice unwavering. Turner was no innocent bystander, he was a key player, a manipulator, a man who orchestrated his involvement with Robert Hayes and Seraph Energy to cover his own tracks. And let's be clear, he didn't do this to protect some grand conspiracy. He did it for one reason and one reason alone: survival. Michael Turner will do whatever it takes to save himself. His lies, convoluted stories, and calculated timing, they were all part of a desperate act to postpone his fate. As Parks spoke, Detective Mark Yates sat near the front row, his arms crossed firmly against his chest. He had seen this case from beginning to end, from the mangled corpse of Emily Parker to the web of corporate greed that sealed David Brooks' fate. He exchanged a glance with his partner, Steve McConnell, who gave a faint nod. This was it, the reckoning they had worked tirelessly to reach. Parks approached the defense table slowly, picking up a single sheet of paper. "This," she said, holding it up for the jury to see, "is Michael Turner's last attempt to manipulate justice. It's an affidavit he sent from prison, claiming he had crucial evidence for solving Brooks' murder. What did that evidence do? It sent us chasing ghost leads and dead ends. But ironically, it also pulled Turner's web of lies into the light." She turned back toward the jury, her voice softening but no less powerful. "You've seen the facts. You've seen the DNA, the phone records, the forged documents, and most importantly, the testimony from dozens of people who worked tirelessly to piece together the truth. Michael Turner thought he could outsmart a broken system, but justice is never as broken as people like him believe. At the defense table, Turner's attorney, Richard Bennett, rose. Bennett was seasoned and composed, a furious advocate who fought hard even when the odds weren't in his favor. This moment wasn't lost on him. He smoothed down his tie before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bennett began, his voice calm and steady, though it carried the weight of desperation, "the prosecution is asking you to believe Michael Turner is the devil himself. They want you to believe that everything aligns perfectly, that two murders years apart, involving completely different parties, somehow come down to him. But that isn't how justice works. Justice requires doubt." Turning toward the jury fully, he placed a firm hand on the rail of the jury box. "Yes, my client has lied in the past, he's not a saint, but being flawed isn't the same as being guilty. Did Michael Turner exaggerate the details about Brooks? Maybe. Did he overreach? Sure. But does that connect him to Brooks's death beyond a reasonable doubt? No." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Bennett continued. "This case has been weighed down with corporate conspiracies, big words, and flashy presentations. But don't let emotions carry you away. My client, Michael Turner, may be guilty of many things, but the burden is on the prosecution to prove every connection. And if there's even an ounce of uncertainty left in you, then justice demands only one verdict. Not guilty." The courtroom sat in hushed anticipation as Judge Barringer dismissed the jury to deliberate. Turner's eyes followed the jurors as they filed out one by one. His attorney leaned close, whispering something, but Michael didn't react. He remained still as a stone, his eyes flicking to Parks briefly before turning back to the clock on the wall. Hours later, the jury returned, their faces unreadable. The courtroom stood in complete silence as the foreperson handed the verdict to the bailiff. Judge Barringer unfolded the paper, her expression as calm and impartial as ever. "In the case of the state of Colorado versus Michael Turner, we find the defendant," she paused, holding the room in agonizing suspense, "guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and a handful of cheers spilled out. Michael Turner didn't move. He sat frozen, his face blank, the weight of the verdict pressing down on him like an avalanche. For once there was no smirk, no clever retort, just silence. As the gavel slammed, Judge Barringer's voice rang out, steady and final. "Michael Turner, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole for your role in the murder of David Brooks. In addition, your original death sentence for the murder of Emily Parker will proceed as previously scheduled. Court is adjourned." The bailiffs moved quickly, placing a firm hand on Michael's shoulder as they prepared to escort him away. His eyes flickered toward Yates in the audience, the slightest shadow of contempt crossing his face. Yates only stared back, unflinching. As Michael was led out of the courtroom, chains clinking with every step, Yates leaned toward McConnell. "That's it," McConnell said quietly, though his tone carried a sense of finality. "It's over." Yates hesitated, watching Turner disappear through the courtroom doors. "Not just yet," he muttered under his breath. "The sentences may be set, but the work isn't done. Seraph Energy's still out there. They're the ones who started this, and we're not letting them walk away clean." McConnell nodded but said nothing. There was always another fight ahead. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed furiously, reporters shouting questions and chasing Yates and Parks as they exited. The Parker family stood together, their tears falling freely, united in both grief and relief. The Brooks family embraced tightly, their hands gripping each other as though David's spirit rested between them. For the first time in years, the families had something they thought they'd never get: closure. Inside his cell later that night, Michael Turner sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the gray walls that had enclosed him for years. No smirks now, no games, just the sound of his own breathing in the quiet, punctuated by the distant hum of fluorescent lights. For Michael Turner, the game was finally, and irrevocably, over.